So, good morning. I want to talk this morning about moving from conflict to connection. And, our Buddhist teachings tell us that conflict typically arises from ignorance, attachment, delusions, all the fundamental or some of the fundamental aspects of human suffering. Conflict arises often from our fundamental misunderstanding of reality. When we perceive ourselves as separate, isolated entities, we're governed by our ego. We fall into patterns of fear, attachment, and aversion that breeds conflict within ourselves and with others. So when we cling to our views, rigidly, our identities, our desires, without recognizing the fluid and impermanent nature of existence, we create fertile ground for discord. And this kind of holding on to our views, wanting to be right, wanting to win, all of that um, often shows up, or most often shows up, I should say, in our interpersonal relationships. We're holding on to different opinions so strongly, holding on to our different interests and worldviews so strongly, often leads to misunderstandings, confrontations, and breakdowns in communication. And so, if we're going to move from that kind of interaction, a conflicted interaction, to genuine connection, we first begin, as we always do, to notice and develop awareness of these patterns within us, the patterns to be right, to prevail, to have our ego win. And the Dharma encourages us to examine the roots of our conflict by looking at ourselves, becoming aware of these patterns of thoughts and emotions. Because then and only then can we gain insight into the motivations behind these actions and these reactions. This self awareness is such a part of our path. And it's the first step toward deconstructing the barriers that separate us from each other. We begin to observe how our minds, how our habits of mind create separation and conflict. Every time I'm in conflict with someone, it's always because of those overarching things of attachment to my ideas, attachment to being right, attachment to having my ego win. So we begin to observe our tendency to judge, to create stories about us versus them, me versus you. And in the process, we end up building walls rather than bridges. It happens to human beings all the time, and it's happening all the time in our modern era. And as our awareness of this process grows, we can start to loosen the grip a little bit on these divisive mental constructs. We recognize that our emotional responses are almost always influenced by our past experiences and our conditioning. And we see how this conflict becomes an obstacle, not, and an obstacle to our growth and understanding, an obstacle to our genuine connection. Now, we all know that compassion is a cornerstone of our practice. It serves as a powerful antidote to conflict. As soon as I can go from having to win to trying to see things from your perspective with compassion, the whole tenor of my response is going to shift. Because what happens when faced with disagreement or hostility or criticism, our default is to react defensively or react angrily. I want to protect myself. I want to not hear what you're saying about me when you're disagreeing with me or being hostile toward me. So moving from conflict to connection requires that I examine my relationship with difficulty itself, with the difficulty of the conflict, the difficulty of my own responses. Buddhism teaches us not to resist or flee from conflict, but to meet it head on with mindful presence. Because every challenging interaction is an opportunity to practice patience, understanding, compassion, to practice walking in the other person's shoes. And we just don't do this. It's not our default. But through this approach, even conflict can become a gateway to deeper connection. Once it's resolved, it builds trust, It builds confidence in the relationship because our teachings tell us that true strength lies in the ability to respond with kindness and empathy. And by fostering compassion, starting with ourselves, toward ourselves and others, we start to dissolve some of the walls of separation that conflict erects. We cultivate the sense, we acknowledge the sense of interconnectedness. We come to understand that the suffering of others is intertwined with our own. If I'm suffering, it's gonna bleed onto you. When you're suffering, in some ways, it's gonna bleed onto me. Because so much conflict is rooted in the suffering of both parties. We bring our suffering together and conflict ensues. And that's a really important awareness to carry because this realization helps us transform animosity into understanding, helps us enable us to approach conflicts not with a spirit of need to win, but with a spirit of reconciliation, not with a spirit of hostility, but a spirit of connection. And perhaps most fundamentally, Buddhism teaches that true connection arises when we release our attachment to fixed ideas, release our attachment to fixed positions, release our attachment to the ego prevailing, to the ego winning. That's where we can move from conflict to connection. If we each examine our responses in conflict, there's a lot of ego in there. There's a lot of wanting the ego to prevail. There's a lot of needing to be right, needing to win, the things we talk about that are ego driven. But the more lightly we hold our opinions and beliefs without rigidly believing it's our way or the highway, the more then we create space for genuine encounter with others. And just contrast that for a moment with this ego-based need to be right, to have the last word, to feel like I win, and to hold on to those views as the only correct ones. We're so competitive in this culture that we're always about winning, about trumping or prevailing over someone else. But we discover that in the process, real connection doesn't even require agreement. It just requires respect for each other's, for the differences, and not feeling like you're wrong and I'm right. And another way of thinking about it is that real connection, without agreement, flourishes in the space of not knowing. Oh, maybe you are right. Maybe I'm wrong. Who knows? I mean, who has the absolute truth here? No one has a corner on that market. We want to have a genuine curiosity about the other person's experience. Wonder how they got there. Wonder what brought them to that kind of thinking. Help me understand, how you got to that position. Not you're wrong. We know from the Buddhist teachings that all phenomenon, and this includes our views and attitudes and prejudices, arise in dependence upon multiple causes and conditions. We all get there through a complicated route. And this is vital to understanding the dynamics of conflict and connection. When we recognize that our attitudes and our actions profoundly affect each other, we begin to broaden and put more spaciousness around conflict. Where individual grievances are seen as part of a larger whole. That the grievances I bring come from my background, my history, my peer group, the people I talk to, the things I read. Likewise, if you have a different point of view. So in this sense, resolving conflicts is more of a communal effort than an isolated struggle. And that's how we create spaciousness. We see it in the broader context. And that also helps loosen the grip of the ego. But when we sit down across from each other in dialogue, share stories, listening to diverse perspectives, learning about others, we build bridges where there were once divisions. I mean, there is nothing better than one-on-one proximity to overcome differences or at least understand each other's point of view. By letting go of this rigid self-concept, we embrace a more fluid understanding of our relationships from which deeper connections emerge. But we have to stay present and aware during moments of tension. If we're in conflict, usually, our hackles are up, our defenses are up, our armor's on. So we have to stay aware because otherwise we're going to default to that conflict mode. But if we stay aware during these moments of tension and conflict, we have a choice. We can choose more skillful responses that come from our values of compassion rather than just reacting impulsively, defensively, aggressively, or whatever. When we see ourselves less from an individual ego perspective, but instead as part of the larger community of humanity, this just strengthens the bonds that connect us. That's more spaciousness. As we walk this path, we discover that connection isn't something we need to create. It's our natural state. We just have to get all the other stuff out of the way. We are social beings. We want to connect. We want community. We want sangha. But we have to get all our garbage out of the way. And all the social and cultural conditioning, family conditioning, which has made us defensive and ego-oriented. In other words, our task is simply to remove, not simply, but it is to remove the obstacles we've placed in the way. So Thich Nhat Hanh often said, quote, "We are here to awaken from the illusion of our separateness. We are here to awaken from the illusion of our separateness. And in this awakening, we find the peace and connection we seek, that it's been there all along once we can awaken to it." So that's moving from conflict to connection.